Hello, and welcome to Friends for Life, a podcast of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's Life Ministry. We're sharing the stories and insights of real people living out God's love for the people He's created. We hope you'll stick around and be our friends for life. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Tiffany Manor, and joining me on Friends for Life today is Dr. Stephen Saunders. He's a professor at Marquette University. Around Friends for Life, we oftentimes use first names, so is it okay if I call you Steve?
Absolutely. Can I call you Tiffany?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
Well, welcome. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your vocations in life.
Well, I'm Steve Saunders. I am professor of psychology at Marquette University, and I'm a Lutheran Missouri Synod my church is in Greenfield, Wisconsin. It is Our Father's Lutheran Church. There's a school, there's child care. I'm a husband, father of 3, and grandfather of 2 with 2 on the way. And
Two on the way.
In reverse order of importance is how I indicated who I am. So most important is the grandfather stuff. It's just such a joy.
I often say that when I'm introduced and speaking or something and they're reading my bio, I always say that I think the most important thing you need to know about me is that I have 2 grandchildren.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I spend most of my free time looking at videos. It's so great now because, the parents can send videos of the kiddos doing cute things. And I do wonder about the effect of talking with them online or through FaceTime, what that does to them. Why is Grandpa in this tiny little machine? So, but it's a real joy. And so...
Yeah, it's too bad we're just audio only. We could be showing pictures of our really cute grandkids to all the listeners, but they're going to have to just imagine that between, my grandkids and your grandkids, we, 6 of the cutest kids in the world represented.
Yeah, I mean, without doubt.
Well, we're not going to just talk about our grandkids all day as much as we might like to do that. We're going to talk about mental illness, and you've got some great expertise, of course, through your vocation as a professor and as a psychologist, and I'm sure you've walked with a lot of people through difficult times, but as a Lutheran layman too, you've done a lot of study on Martin Luther and how Martin Luther understands mental illness. So tell us what you've studied and what you've learned about.
Yeah, well, my journey in this, I've always sort of been interested in psychology and how the mind works, and the reality that 2 different people can look at the same thing and think very different ways about it and feel very different ways about it, react differently to it. And I went to college as a pre-med and realized I don't like biology, so there's so much for pre-med. But I took a course in psychology, and I really liked it, and I took another, and 8 years later, I graduated with my doctoral degree in clinical psychology with particular interest in treatment of mental illness, and within that, a particular interest in why people don't seek treatment for mental illness, which is related to all the stigma that tends to be attached to mental illness. Somehow, unlike almost any other illness, medical, physical illness, mental illness, somehow we attach some blame to the person. They're not strong enough. I like to sometimes say that somehow the person who develops depression or anxiety or whatever mental illness, they didn't run fast enough and keep ahead of it, some version of weakness or badness. And we don't do that with any other illness, just mental illness. So have spent really a career doing that as well. In my academic life, I've always maintained a practice where I actually see clients. Most clinical psychologists are full-time clinicians. They see 25, 30 people a week. But I always maintained a practice, and my family has a lot of Missouri Synod pastors in it, my in-laws in particular. And I got to know a lot of different pastors them in particular, but their friends and my own pastor, and pretty regularly getting questions from pastors about parishioners. I've got this parishioner, I don't quite understand what's happening with her, or I'm worried about this one person in my church, and I welcomed those conversations. And two things occurred to me. One is that there's a lot of need for better understanding of mental illness, mental health problems. But the other is that persons with mental health problems tend to go to their church, which makes perfect sense. The church is where our children and our grandchildren are baptized. It's where our children are married. It's where our parents are buried. It's where weekly we go and hear the loving word of God and what He has done for us. And so, of course, people go to their church when they're feeling this badly. And so that led me to write a 2-volume set to help pastors, laypersons, teachers better understand mental illness. And while doing that, I stumbled upon some of the writings of Martin Luther, and meaning some of his table talk, which is, of course, other people recording what he said at his table. He and his wife, Katie, invited people over all the time, and they would talk and talk and talk, and got around to where people started to record what he was saying because it was so, vital and so important. But also, we have so many letters that Martin Luther wrote to other people, thousands of letters. I think it was the case that Luther got thousands of letters and probably used them to keep his house warm. But anyone who got a letter, burned them in the fireplace to keep his house warm. Anyone who got a letter from Luther, though, kept it. And so we literally have thousands of letters. And quite a few of them were letters from Luther to persons dealing with mental health issues. And I just became fascinated by his perspective on it. So it's really, really enjoyable reading his letters. They're available to people, and really fascinated about his insights into what he was talking about with those with mental illness, mental health problems.
Yeah, and we can give a shout out to Concordia Publishing House too. So that's where you can obtain a lot of Martin Luther's, his works in totality, at least those that are translated into English. There's still a lot of his works, his writings that are not yet in English, but they're diligently working on it. And I think you're even going to be having a book coming out in upcoming months. So
right.
People could stay tuned for that, for your book available through Concordia Publishing House.
Yeah, it will be about Martin Luther's attitude or his perspective and his advice regarding mental illness. Exactly. So
what is it that Martin Luther, sometimes we think about mental health issues being particularly endemic to our times, that, with coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, that there's a mental health crisis because of that. But even, obviously mental illness existed before that. But I don't know that we often think about 500 years ago that Martin Luther was, and his parishioners, the congregants in his congregations, and the people that he knew, that they were dealing with the same things we are today. But it sounds to me like you're describing they probably were.
Yeah. Oh, there's no doubt. It's, when Adam fell, and the world became corrupted by sin, we got medical illnesses, physical illnesses, and mental illnesses. And, of course, many mental illnesses are caused by experiences. They're not all biological. They're a mix of biological and experience. But definitely Luther was saying that, if we think about Luther's age, there was really no such thing as sanitation. There was near constant warfare, lots of illness. He and his wife, suffered through the death of a child young child and older kids as well. So just, surrounded by tragedy and grief in the medieval era, as they say. And so back in the day, it wasn't called mental illness, but we had the term melancholia, which we still use sometimes. I'm feeling melancholic. I'm feeling depressed. That's literally where it comes from, melancholia, and that's what Luther referred to depression as. And of course, there would have also been schizophrenia and persons who had severe head injuries that could no longer take care of themselves. We don't read a lot about the anxiety disorders back then, but I think it's pretty clear that depression and anxiety are so closely related that research is increasingly showing this, that it's almost impossible sometimes to distinguish them. Most people with depression are also anxious. A lot of people with anxiety also experience depression. So, but yeah, Luther had, and of course Luther himself, it's almost definitive that he had himself mental health problems. He said so himself. In some of his letters, he said, I spent much of my youth in a melancholic state. And the other thing that's fascinating about looking at what Luther's personal experiences were like is how very sick he was in so many ways. He had gallstones, kidney stones. He had tinnitus, not constant, but regular buzzing in his ears, and he was in an ulcerative wound on his left leg that he had for a decade. And so the commonality for everything what Luther experienced physically was pain. And so, and of course anyone who's dealt with pain knows how seriously depressing it is. It's just really, it's physically debilitating, but it's also emotionally debilitating. So Luther had a lot of personal experience with physical pain contributing to his maybe bad mood. I think it's, after reading all this, I thought it was amusing. So many people thought that, well, Luther is so irritable.
He's crabby.
He's a crab. Could you imagine going through what he went through and being cheerful all the time? Of course he was crabby. Heaven's sakes. But also he acknowledged himself that, he had some mental health issues, got some really good advice from some of his mentors. It was fascinating to read that, when Luther, came out with his statements and the Pope said, well, this is heresy, and we're going to, anyone kill him on sight. And so his friends, of course, secret him away to Wartburg Castle. And Luther, he wrote himself, he writes about his own behavior. He said, over the weeks, I increasingly withdrew from the others at the castle and just spent time by myself, and it made me very depressed. Now, 10 years later, he's writing to other young men and young women alike, older men, older women, but especially to the young, he would say, don't isolate. Hang out with people, socialize, go hunting, go singing, have fun. Saying this to people with depression, the famous to me, his quote, young people don't realize how really bad it is for young people to, he didn't use the word isolate, but to stay away from others, and emphasizing something that I emphasize with people that I'm treating for depression, that my colleagues emphasize when they're treating someone with depression, which is it's really important that you go out and do fun things. You might not anticipate having fun, but do it anyway. And it's good for your mental health. You cannot isolate. You can't let your emotions dictate your behavior. You have to engage in, again, socialization, especially, the most obvious social outlet for people, obvious in terms of advice, is go to church. Go to church every Sunday. And then when church is over, go to Bible study. You might not feel like it. You might think that people don't want you there. That's not true. That's just a thought you're having. Do these things for yourself, and it will help your depression. And just really, so his advice to people was based on, I think, largely, his own experiences. And it's just really amazing how his advice, to me, it's amazing to read his advice 500 years ago and to realize that's what I was taught in graduate school 20 years ago. And this is what I teach my graduate students now, exactly what Luther is saying, which is to be aware of how you think and be wary of how you think and be aware of your behavior, and doing both will help you with your mental health.
Wow, that's pretty amazing to think that wisdom stands the test of time. But I think there's also something we can glean in there about stigma, because that so often comes up, that the church doesn't acknowledge mental illness, the church doesn't address it, doesn't speak to it. But it sounds like really quite the opposite. If that was 500 years ago, some of the fathers in the church were providing counsel for mental health and mental illness, behavioral issues.
I think that's probably the best example, the best role modeling that Luther did for us, which is that he did not shrink from people's sadness, from what people were going through, neither physically nor mentally, emotionally, that he wrote them back. In one instance, famous instance, he actually invited the wife of a friend of his was experiencing depression, and he wrote and said, "Come and stay with us." And he talked with her every day and wrote back to her husband about what he thought about what she was going through. So Luther, again, is an example for all of us to understand that there are lots of people in the church. Research is pretty consistent that 1 in 5 persons right now is experiencing some sort of a mental health problem. Depression, anxiety being the most common, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, which we used to call manic depression, also common. And it's really important that persons feel welcome at the church. Now, the thing about mental health problems is they're easy to hide for the most part, especially depression, anxiety. Someone can go to church, might be experiencing severe depression, and they can go to church and they can smile at the pastor and smile at their friends and sit and, kind of force themselves to act like they're not depressed. And as a result, we don't know they're depressed. And, a phrase I've developed is, all of us know many people who have depression, anxiety. We just don't know who they are. And we don't know who they are because they haven't told us. And why haven't they told us? Well, because they're afraid of what people might think. And I think Christians in particular, and Luther addressed this explicitly. I think Christians in particular sometimes feel extra guilty for being depressed or anxious, or for having a child with a severe mental illness. They feel extra guilty, not just shame. They feel extra shame, as if a good Christian doesn't experience this. And Luther himself said, "Don't be foolish." Christ himself, I'm quoting Luther, Christ himself found life unendurable, as did Moses, as did Elijah. Abraham was so fearful that he said to his wife Sarah, "Don't tell anyone you're my wife, because they might want to, because the king might want you. So don't tell him, because then he'll kill me." So all of the David and what he went through and what he did, all of these persons in the Bible that are admirable, that some of whom literally talked with God, often found life unbearable. To quote Luther. So Luther was very careful to correct people, to say, this is not an issue of faith. In fact, don't lose your faith, but also realize that this is what it means to be a Christian, that we do suffer. Luther emphasized what we refer to, of course, as the theology of the cross. Christ himself promised every one of us, pick up your cross and follow me. That's the theology of the cross, which is follow me, believe that I have come to pay for your sins. But that doesn't mean that your life will necessarily be easy, especially as a Christian, maybe especially in 2023 right now, where there's so much hostility, more and more open hostility towards Christians. So that's part of the cross, but part of the cross is being sick and suffering and watching those we love sick and suffering. And again, Luther was very explicit, saying, don't mistake this for God being angry at you or God abandoning you or you not having strong enough faith, because that's not what it is.
I think that we get very good at speaking the law to ourselves, and that's where people this shame and the guilt that you described. It's someone I ought to, I should,
Right.
and those are law words.
Right.
When we're just heaping expectations upon ourselves, things that God has not said to us as the law that He's given to us, which is good and beneficial for us as the law can be. Sometimes we add burdens to ourselves that we ought not, and so I like to remind the people that I've cared for as a deaconess. We can speak the gospel to ourselves. We can place ourselves in places where people are speaking the gospel to us, church certainly being one. Right. But the gospel being what God is working, what God is doing, that as you described, all this suffering that we experience in our world, and it will not fail to come. It will continue until Christ returns to recreate all of heaven and earth and us in our bodies. And so we're going to have this suffering, but God in His promises has poured out so much on us, and so to remind ourselves that He's with us, He's present. Emmanuel, right? Emmanuel is not just a name for God in Christ at Christmas time. It's
right. For
always God with us in our suffering. Christ Himself, as you described, known in suffering, and God can use that suffering in a variety of ways. We don't often know what He's doing with the suffering we're experiencing, but we can certainly bear that suffering with one another. That's another benefit, even when things are challenging. A reason to go to church. My husband's a pastor. We don't have a whole lot of pastors in our family, like you were describing. Just one, just my husband. But he would always tell people when they most felt like they needed to shy away from church. They didn't want to go to church. It was hard to go to church, and he would say that's when it's most important. You need to be getting to church more often, whether it's individual counsel with him, with their pastor, any worship service, the fellowship with the saints. But whenever you feel yourself not wanting to go, that's when you most need to be there. Just so.
And again, persons with anxiety, depression, and sometimes it's parents or loved ones with a child who has an issue such as an autism spectrum disorder or cognitive impairment, which we used to refer to as mental retardation, and they might be disruptive in church, but this is where they belong. And I think it's incumbent. I really encourage anyone listening, all pastors, reach out, because again, some things like if a child is yelling in church because of an illness, some illnesses, some mental health problems, they can be easily seen but the vast majority cannot. But we know they're there. So reach out by a variety of means, include prayers for not just physical medical illnesses, but prayers for those experiencing emotional disorders. Prayers not just for doctors and surgeons, but also those mental health professionals helping. Inserts, little statements in the bulletin about Lutheran Social Services, a wonderful agency, about, local counseling, about, we're going to do a Bible study on mental illness, mental health problems in the Bible, just to make people know, like we don't know who you are. We can't know who you are until you tell us, but we do know you're here, and we welcome you, and we're not afraid of what you're going through. We're not ashamed of you. We are just like you. You are just like us. It's just that your burden, the cross you bear, is a little bit different. And if people could just take that attitude and not be, fearful or not, turn away, but rather, and so someone comes to you and says, I've been dealing with depression, or 10 years ago, my son committed suicide. Oh, well, what do I say? What would you say to someone who said, I'm dealing with cancer? You'd say, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. How's it going? Oh, I'm so sorry that you went through that. That sounds bad. Let's meet for coffee and talk about it. It's really just the same. We know how to do that. I tell people, you already know how to do this with persons with mental illness. Just allow yourself to do it. Allow yourself to realize, that just a cheerful word and an invitation over, and just simple Christian compassion and consolation, and a reminder that, God does love you. And it's a mystery as to why we have to go through these things, but never forget that God loves you, and hope to see you next week at church. So,
yeah, that's initiating that kind of contact is so meaningful. And it gets easier. We get better at it the more we do it.
Right.
And, and really, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is providing more resources to help people understand mental illness, mental health, and how we can bear burdens together and care for one another. There's, a recent Lutheran Witness issue focused fully, the entire issue focused on mental illness, mental health. We've got a webpage that's up. You can go to LCMS.org, put in the search bar, mental illness, mental health. You'll come up with the resources are ongoing. Dr. Saunders, Steve here on the podcast, you've been a big part of that. So we're so thankful for your efforts, for the books you've written, for really being someone who's opened our eyes to the number of people who are dealing with mental illness in our congregations and out in the world around us. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us on this episode here. And thanks so much to our listeners for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, listeners, please leave us a review, and don't forget to click the follow or subscribe button so you don't miss out on upcoming episodes. New episodes drop twice each month. And you can find us in between on Facebook and Instagram as Friends for Life, LCMS. And finally, listeners, we want to hear from you. If you have an idea about a guest you'd like to hear from or a topic you want to talk about, you can email us at friendsforlife@lcms.org. Thanks for joining us. Friends for Life is a podcast that introduces listeners to life issues by introducing them to friends who stand for life.